So we're talking about these potentially shippable increments. The questions I got during the break was, well, you talk about these synchronizing every 2 weeks. Well, what if you can't synchronize? What if somebody is running late? And we're talking 2-week increments. By the way, how many working days is 2 weeks?
About 8.
14.
We're all programming. 15. It's a range between 8 and 14. But it actually turns out that it's closer to 8. Because the first day and the last day of a sprint is a lot of planning and a lot of demoing, a lot of tidying up. So you really have 8 days of real development. So you could really shove in a lot of work on someone's plate, and they only have 8 days. So if you're not really careful with that, you can end up not being able to complete what was committed for that sprint. But what we do is we say we have a time box. That's what a time box is. By definition, whatever you get done, you get done. Whatever you don't get done, it just doesn't make it into your small, potentially shippable increment, right? So we force the synchronization. So what we don't want to see happen is these teams get out of sync, and then you're back to the old problem of project overruns and projects being late, deliveries being late, and then you have the old problem of we've got too much features and too little time, and you have feature creep and scope creep and all these kind of bad dreams, nightmares start coming up. So we force the synchronization every 2 weeks, and then we also force it every 10 weeks.
Synchronization, if they're all releasing at the same time and doing the product owner reviews and all that, do you run out of product owners and stuff to do that, or do they end up being staggered so they're within a few days of each other? Or
yeah, usually a lot of times they'll get, practically how this happens is they'll demo, you'll reserve a room like this size with a projector, and teams will come in and they'll take half-an-hour slots throughout the day. So they'll get to demo all their things to the stakeholders, and the stakeholders will stay in the room.
right, just power through it.
And if you're unlucky, Oracle will send out a Java update as soon as you do your demo, and it won't work. Happened today.
Yeah, and that's a really good reason to turn that off.
Right.
If you have if you have
Automatic
the features.
updates.
Yes. All right.
Can you-
So,
can
yes.
So you just kind of said, oh, we force them to sync up. But, what if one team is late, and what if?
Okay,
It doesn't always. You can't always do it, right?
Well, actually, so let's say you have 10 things you're going to do in that sprint, and your time box comes to an end. You only have 8. Right? Those 8 things are what you're going to demo. Those 2 things you didn't do will get pushed back on the backlog. Okay. So we always honor the time box.
So you really are done, it's just the scope that
Yes.
changes.
So another kind of funny way to put it is your projects will never be late.
That's a positive
It's just that the
viewpoint.
features may not
You
get it.
just change what you committed to.
Exactly.
Why work in 10-week increments when you could just release every 2 weeks, and if it's ready, it's ready, and if it's not ready, it just goes in the next release? Like,
Yeah, so that's actually my next slide, is what do we mean by release? So, so one of the things with synchronization is that you want a heartbeat. It's kind of like you don't want to go a minute and then just have like a big heartbeat. You want to have small, consistent heartbeats. And that's what we're doing here. So as an organization, you want to have a heartbeat every 2 weeks, where the teams go, okay, here's what we got done, here's what we can demo. We didn't do everything that was on our to-do list, but here is what we did get done. And everything that we did get done, here, here's how we're going to show that and get feedback on. So now, what actually we release to our customers is a little different. This is where a lot of confusion comes in. So this is this slide to kind of get that resolved. Is that the PSI, just like at the sprint, every 2 weeks release, every 10 weeks, we're gonna release the big program level, potentially shippable increment. But it's an internal release. So if you look at this, the yellow, the big ones are the program releases. But we also have these sprint releases, right? There's there's 4 of these in between. Now, what actually goes to the customer depends on what the business is prepared to show them. It's more of a business decision, right? Because just because you're ready to ship something doesn't mean that it makes business sense to ship it. Because your clients might not be ready to receive it. Or the clients may not see enough value in that release for them to actually receive it. Right? It also depends on your application. If you're a website, right, it's a little different. How many releases do you think Google makes to Gmail? Every month. Do they ask for permission? They didn't ask mine. But if you're doing medical devices, right, you can't just walk into a hospital and say, hey, by the way, we got a new release, you're gonna love it.
You wanna be the first to try?
Yeah. So it's a much longer process depending on the application. So, however, you still wanna honor these PSI, this regular heartbeat internally. What actually goes out kind of depends. And you can release to the customer in the middle of the PSIs, at the PSIs, boundaries. They could be new features, they could be custom upgrades, they could be, you know, all kinds of different reasons why you might choose to release the software to your customer or not, or choose not to release. I would say most cloud-based organizations release about 3 times a year. I have a client right now, they've been releasing every 2 years, and now they want to go to every year, and the people are saying every year, that's too many releases. So it varies, because these guys, they release to nuclear power plants, so it's a little bit different sort of a situation. All right, so there's a lot of planning that goes into it. So we've talked about the release planning at the beginning of the release, and then there's the actual PSI release, the internal release of the software. So planning at large scale for organizations is usually, there's a lot of drama that goes along with that. Anybody here a project manager? Okay, so project managers spend a lot of their bandwidth trying to figure out, well, when can we get together and plan? And here we're talking about getting everybody together, everybody in the program. This is typically between 80 to 120 people in the same auditorium doing planning for 2 days. Okay, and we're gonna do that about 4 times a year. Okay, so if you divide 52 by 10 and throw out the holidays, that's how many of these events you get a year.
So these are program level planning.
Program level plan, but it involves everybody in the program. And so, but what we do is, because it's routine, because we know it's happening every 10 weeks, we can plan in advance. And we can announce it and say, okay, before anybody makes any of their vacation decisions, here's the plan. Here's when we're having these. So, take your vacations around that schedule. Okay? And when we're talking about large companies have been around a while. And what that means is that they have employees that have been around a while. And what that means is that they have a lot of vacation built up. Right? So in large companies, trying to get key players who were people that have been around a while in that company to actually synchronize schedules is extremely difficult. Trying to schedule a meeting with 2 or 3 key players usually takes like a month. Because when this guy's available, that guy's on vacation. And when that guy's available, this guy's in some offsite. So what this does is, because we do it in advance, all that drama goes away. And because we do it routinely, we can bring down the cost. So you book a hotel room, or a lot of these meetings have to happen in large auditoriums. If you book it 6 months in advance, you can get a deal. You can book airlines. People have to fly in for these events. If you know when those dates are, you can get much better deals. So you can drive the cost down. And the other thing is, people balk at the 2 days of planning. That's a lot of time. And what you got to remember is, if you don't do this, how many hundreds of meetings do you think you'll have to attend? How many emails do you think will fly back and forth in trying to communicate? How many documents and that kind of thing? All that goes away, or I should say, most of it goes away. And so these meetings are quite the events. They usually will have, if you're working with an offshore partner, you'll have them on display. You'll have a team over there that's staying in sync with the team on this side. Teams will sit in tables, like round tables, so that they'll have the ability to sort of communicate and plan. And the reason we do this all at once, all together, is because we want everybody to be in a line of sight of one another. So if I have a dependency on your team, I can walk over and talk to you. If we need to whiteboard something together, we can do that. Everybody is at the same place, planning at the same time. And these things get kind of wild. I mean, if you look here, you've seen small post-it. There's these big post-its that get put up all around the place. So the result of this 2 days of meeting is a committed set of program objectives for the next PSI. So you've heard of sprint planning. We're planning for the next 2 weeks. This is planning for the next 10 weeks. And we come out of this 2 days of planning with a locked and loaded plan for the next 10 weeks. And it's quite prescriptive. And that's the other thing about the Scaled Agile Framework, is there's a lot of prescriptive things. And so here, there's even a sample agenda of what you should do on day 1 and what you should do on day 2. Now, this prescription turns off some people. So, hey, if you're telling us how to do our meetings, you're telling us what roles to have. But there's a reason for that. And the reason is that prescriptive things, what they help you do is focus on what's important and not argue about things that don't really matter. They're kind of like coding standards. If you don't have them, because you just believe that people should be able to code, it's a personal form of expression. Do you think that avoids arguments about coding style, or do you end up having more arguments because you don't have coding standards? And what's more important, what you're building or the coding standard? So by being prescriptive, you kind of eliminate the argument over when should we have this meeting, and should it be 2 days or 3 days or 1 day? It's set. You're meeting for 2 days, and here's who participates. Here's what we're going to talk about. Now, the content, right? What's going to be said during the business context? That's really what's important. What's going to be said during this product vision? What are we going to actually do in this team breakouts? The content is what's important, not when you do it. Right? So prescriptive things are actually highly useful to have so that the teams can focus on what really differentiates them. Right? So what is the value that you're building? That's what you want people to focus on. And that's one of the things that slows teams down, is they spend too much time, especially when they go to implement Agile, because it's so loosey-goosey in a lot of companies. They start arguing over, well, we should have 4-week sprints. We can get more done that way. Somebody else says, no, actually I've heard that we're supposed to do 2-week sprints. Right? Somebody else says, well, the daily stand-up should happen first thing in the morning. And And somebody says, well, no, actually it should happen at the end of the day, because that way we have something to talk about. Just get rid of all that discussion. Just say, hey, we're doing it this way, and now we can focus on actually what we talk about. And so this actually ends up helping companies. Now, once you've been doing it for a while, you can kind of tweak certain things, you know, shorten the time, you can, but this at least helps you get started. Okay. So here's just some pictures I have of these release planning meetings. Here we have the architecture team presenting their vision for the architecture of the next PSI. Team breakout meetings, so highly dynamic. They use multicolor Post-its. The Post-it colors actually mean different things. So that, for instance, if you're using the color orange for spikes or experiments, they stand out. And that way you can kind of look across the room and say, gosh, we got a lot of orange. There's a lot of research going on. Or defect fixes could be red. So when you look across, you can see there's a lot of defects for fixing this PSI. So here's kind of each sprint actually gets planned out, and we reserve the last sprint, we call it a hardening sprint. And the reason for that is, in real life, if you're actually gonna ship something or even internally release anything, you need some time to tidy things up, to get your documentation together, to put together any kind of release notes, to do testing on defects that were caught later during the PSI. So what's seen is that if you don't have that hardening sprint, teams are not able to finish all their work. Now, as teams get better, you may not need that hardening sprint, but initially it's a good idea to keep it. Okay, so, and then finally we do a confidence mode. We go table by table and say, okay, so based on this plan, what's your confidence level that you'll be able to meet the plan? And teams will do a fist of 5, 1 being I'm not confident at all, to 5 being I'm very confident it's going to happen. And that way, you know, people get to actually vote on their confidence level.
What happens if they say no confidence?
Yeah, so when they have no confidence, now that's time to have a conversation. So what exactly is it that that you have issues? And usually what will happen is they'll have a list of objectives that they're gonna meet, say 10 objectives, and there'll be one of those objectives. They say, you know what, we might get that done if all the stars line up, but I'm not willing to commit to it.
Mm-hmm.
There's usually 1 or 2 items. And so that's what you want out of this conversation. And so what the teams will do is they'll draw a line and say, okay, this is our stretch goal. We think we'll be able to meet these, but we're not committing to it. And they'll move those items below that line.
Mm-hmm.
And so the commitment is for everything above the line. So that's how they break through that sort of a barrier. There have been times where I've seen a team will move everything below the line.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They're not willing to commit to anything because it's
Right.
brand new territory. They're one of their key people just quit, right? But it's good for the rest of the program to know that and to see it firsthand, not to hear it through the project manager. And this is actually, turns out it's a very good team building exercise. So instead of actually going out in the jungle and climbing trees and doing that kind of thing, you're actually doing real work and building up your team. All right, so I said we would save some time for Q&A. How much time? What time is it? 8:30. 8:30. Okay, good. So I know a lot of you guys are doing Agile, and you maybe run into some issues that you might want to bring up or let the rest of us know about and get some input. Anybody What's your experience doing Agile? Do you love it?
Yeah, it's good.
It's good. Okay.
Found it. Couldn't really
Who
help.
hates it? Usually I get one or two hands.
I think the term is misused.
Oh, okay. Tell us about that.
With Agile, so you can adapt and adopt to anything.
Yeah,
So like
it'll make you
get the
go
deadline.
faster.
That's right. Get the deadline, get it
Yeah.
more done.
So,
Rusty.
here's a list of questions I get a lot. Okay, so, because I'm talking to technology people, the first thing they'll ask me, what tool do you recommend for managing our team's progress? So what project management tools should we use? That's like, I get that. The other one I get is, we're working harder than ever, yet we can't seem to complete all the user stories within the sprint. That's what you were saying. So that's a chronic problem of a lot of Agile teams. Here's another one. Our team's morale has gone down ever since we adopted Agile. It's kind of related to the previous move, because they're working really hard, they're not finishing, they go to the demo and half their stuff's not done. The team gets beaten up a lot. Here's another one. Our product owner doesn't provide enough details for the user story. So where should we get them? Where are we supposed to get these details? And then finally this one, what is a team member's career path in Agile? How do I get promoted? Where do I go? What do I do in my career? What does that look like in Agile? Any of you guys have any of these or other issues that have come up? Yeah.
Well, if you're working on like government contracts, they usually have a very fixed deadline and very fixed budget.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
and sometimes I think if you're working with new technologies, you don't really know how long it's going to take you to get the job done.
Very
Which
true.
is like a perfect case for Agile, except under the condition that you're under a contract.
Never
Yeah.
take a fixed price contract.
But I mean, that's what a lot of them are, so. I don't know how some things.
Yeah,
some
there's
companies-
something called buffering, not padding. That's handy and those sort of stuff. But, so I thought maybe we'd take a look at a couple of these. One that's kind of interesting is how do you actually take one of those features, this large grain, and how do you break it up? How do you break up a user story? This is the thing I think a lot of people struggle with a lot is, hey, it's as small as it's gonna get and it's gonna take 10 weeks, or it's gonna take 6 months to do. You can't make it any smaller. Right, so you're talking about doing something every 2 weeks. We can't get things any smaller than, 6 weeks. So I thought we could maybe take a look at that and see what you guys think of that. And then we'll maybe tackle the morale issue. All right, so user stories are too big. If they're bigger, usually it's the rule of thumb is you want a user story to fit well within half a sprint. So you want user stories to be about 3 to 5 man days of effort. If you want to see if you've got the right size. So any user story in your backlog that's bigger than that needs to be split up. So the question is, how do you split it? How do you take a user story and split it? So it turns out these are some common techniques. And let's start out with the first one, the workflow steps. So let's take a common sort of an application we're used to. You go to purchase something, right? So if your user story is, I want the ability to make a purchase with a credit card, right? That's a user story. You think you can code that in 2 weeks? Yes. Okay.
50-50 shot.
Yeah. Now, can you support all the different credit cards? Can you support Visa, MasterCard, Diners Card, Discovery, all of those?
whatever PayPal supports, or whatever.
Chances are, I'm gonna guess that's too much work for 2 weeks, to get it designed, built, and tested in under 2 weeks. So you're gonna want to come up with a way that you can split that so that you can make sure you can comfortably fit it in 2 weeks. So one way to do that is using workflow steps, right? And say, okay, well, in order to make a payment, I've got to go through these steps, right? First, I have to be able to say, okay, how am I going to pay for it? So I need some kind of a UI for me to select the method of payment. And then I'm going to select my method of payment. And now I'm going to actually need to collect some information. Okay, what is the credit card number? What's the expiration date? What's the secret code in the back? All of those things. And then the next step is I'm going to send that information for validation. And then the next step is what? Anybody guess what? Well, you have to get an acknowledgement that you have enough credit, and then you can actually make the full payment. And there's probably other steps I'm missing, but the whole thing of making a credit card payment turns out to be maybe 15 steps. So you can take multiple of those steps that each one of those steps is pretty small. It could be maybe 1 day of work, half a day of work, maybe one of them would be 2 days of work. So splitting those workflow steps is a common way of splitting the user story, a big user story into smaller user stories. Now, why do you think you want to split things into smaller user stories? Why not just take a 2-week user story and do it all at once?
You want to share it across team members, and also you want to see progress as it's moving where the obstacles come up. Be able to dynamically rearrange how you're creating it to the current
Very good.
circumstances.
Yeah. And you guys see something? Yeah,
Something
same thing.
Well,
Yeah, so because so we have a design, build, and test. We want to be able to get something to testing, right? We don't, a common sort of a failure pattern that happens with Agile is if you have 10 days, the first 8 days, people are pounding on the keyboard, coding. And on day 8, this massive truck backs up on the tester and says, okay, here, test this. And they have a massive amount of things to test, not enough time. And of course, they feel guilty because they're the last person in that flow. And it's like, hey, we couldn't get done with it. We couldn't get through testing. Well, they didn't get it until day 8. How could you expect them to finish testing? So when you have a smaller user story, testing gets engaged on day 3 or day 4 of the sprint rather than day 8 or 9. So another reason is that things that are smaller are easier to estimate. So if I know I have one screen, or if I have one transaction, several queries, it's much easier to estimate that than to say, okay, here's some complex algorithm I've got to write. I have no idea how to do it. That becomes much harder to estimate. So another method of splitting user stories is this one: major effort, smaller effort. Usually user stories like the one I just described, making a credit card payment. How hard is it to collect the information for the credit card versus making that gateway transaction and dealing with PayPal? Which do you think is more work? Anybody done UIs on the web?
I was doing PayPal probably, but I've never done it.
Because you've never done it, it seems like that might be probably a lot more work. Because you first of all have to go and research what is the API, what are the web services you've got to call, how do they work? You probably have to register. I mean, there's a lot of steps that you're not aware of. Doing the GUI is pretty straightforward for that particular case. So one way to deal with it is, okay, let's split that into what's the simple part of it and what's the major effort. So let's split it that way. And then we can do the small effort first. Maybe the user story is, hey, we're just gonna collect the input. We're not actually gonna do the transaction. And usually when I tell people this, they say, hey, I thought the user story was supposed to deliver some kind of value. But if all you're doing is collecting the information, you're not providing any value. Well, we're talking about incremental value, right? So incrementally, we're building up something that will be of value to the customer. But this is kind of our first step in that process.
You are delivering value though, because the business user could look at it and say, I want it to look
Exactly.
different.
The end user can't use it, but it is providing incremental value so that the end user at some point will get the full value. So that's the way to start thinking about these user stories. Yeah.
So if you don't complete your sprint and it goes on the backlog, it seems to me like it wouldn't make sense to continue on with the rest of the PayPal thing. If you can't read in the user data, it's gonna make that very difficult to do. How does that?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand.
So you were saying if you don't complete, like say you don't get the UI done on time, it comes in late. The next story is to get the transactional in PayPal. You really can't do the next portion because you haven't finished
Right.
the first one. So
Right, so if you don't finish it, you have to, in your next sprint, you'll have to pick that up.
those you can just pick it back up.
Yes.
But how would you handle it if you wanted to have multiple teams work on these smaller stories, and then you would have these dependencies? Like you wanted a separate team to work on the gateway.
Yeah.
And they
Yeah.
didn't have,
Good point.
the other team was working on the UI.
That's excellent point. So one of the things is there's actually a lot of techniques of dealing with like external entities. So if I'm building the UI and I'm not going to build the gateway code, right? But my code needs to now interact with the gateway code. So one of the techniques that's used is if at the release planning, if your team's going to build the gateway interaction, I'm going to build the UI, is we agree on the contract. What is that web service call that I'm going to make to you? And the very first thing, the very first user story that you have is building that interface with a mock object underneath it, right? So you give that to me on day 2, I build my UI around that. And if you've done a good job, you also have a way for me to get some exceptions so that I can actually do some testing with my UI and your mock object. And in the following sprint, I'll actually get the implementation of that. So these are ways that you can collaborate with other teams. And you want to be able to have these techniques so that you can do a lot of parallel development. So simple and complex is another one. If you have, anytime you want to interface like with the PayPal gateway, one way to think about it is, what's the simplest way that I can make this work? What's the simplest case of interacting with the PayPal gateway? What's the simplest thing you could do with any kind of external service? If I was going to interact with Facebook,
Go to their website.
go there, well, if you're gonna actually programmatically interface with Facebook or PayPal or whatever, you might wanna just say, hey, just doing a handshake, some kind of handshake or authentication. I'm gonna send you my credentials, and you tell me that I'm logged in. I'm a valid user. And that could be your very first user story. Because usually when you're dealing with something that's an unknown, doing the very, very simplest thing, all of a sudden you learn a ton just by doing that very simple thing. So the case in point is, I was trying to interact with Facebook programmatically. I had no idea. I thought it was an API call, like, Facebook dot something, call a method. Turns out actually it's quite complex. It uses open authentication framework, and there's quite a few steps you got to go through just to get logged in. Now, once you're logged in, now it's got a pretty rich set of APIs that you can call and get XML messages back and parse, and you can get past that point. So a lot of times just doing a very simple case. So for instance, if you're gonna get data back from, let's say it's an EDI format, right? Something very, difficult to read. Being able to crack that EDI message and getting the simplest thing out of it is the hardest part a lot of times. Once you figure that out, then the rest of it comes a lot easier. And then here's another one I was going to say. Oh yeah, splitting by the CRUD operations. So anytime you see the word, I need to be able to manage my accounts. I need to be able to manage my my users, right? Or at the very simplest way, there's at least 4 ways to split that. One is by, I got to be able to create that thing. I got to be able to read it back in. I got to be able to update it and be able to delete it or somehow mark it as deleted. At the very least, there's 4 ways to split that. Problem is, most of us, when we see this kind of user story, we say, oh, that's just one, that's a couple days of work. That's like a natural developer's response. Is that I can do that in, maybe 2 hours and then another couple hours of testing, and then it turns out to be a big thing. Another common way to split user stories is by acceptance criteria. Now this is not something that's this is very counterintuitive, because usually we think of, hey, if I'm going to do something, it's going to be well tested. One good way is to actually split it by the different scenarios. So you can have a user story that says, okay, this user story only works in the normal case. It doesn't handle any errors. I'll have a different user story that handles maybe a specific kind of error, like for the credit card. This user story interact with the PayPal gateway, and it only works when everything, all the stars are lined up. There's enough money in the account. There's, I have credentials. The thing that I'm buying is legal to buy. All those things. You might have another user story later that says, this is going to handle the international purchase, error. Like if there's certain items that require you to be a U.S. citizen to purchase, PayPal might not let you purchase that. So that might be a separate user story. So you can split these user stories all kinds of ways. The goal is to get it small enough that you can do design, build, and test in between 3 to 5 days. If it gets any bigger than that, that's what leads to a lot of issues with Agile teams. I can tell you, this is probably, on a practical level, this is the biggest problem that Agile teams have, is they take on too big of a user story, and then they get stuck, and then their QA people are sitting, waiting for code to come in to test, and then before you know it, it's the end of the sprint. So another failure pattern is, anybody heard of waterfalling a sprint? So
Seems illegal to say, but.
yeah, yeah. So I've heard of Scrum fall, water sprint, something like that. Anyway, so that's when a lot of teams will say, well, in the first sprint, we're just going to do analysis. In our second sprint, we'll do coding. And then on our third sprint, we're actually going to do testing. And they think they're doing Agile. Here's another way to do it. A little better, but still pretty bad. This is actually more common. The first part of the sprint, we're going to take all of our user stories and do analysis. Days 1, 2, and 3. We're just going to do analysis. days 3, 4, and 5, we're gonna write the code for all of the user stories. And then day 7, 8, and 9, all these user stories will go into testing. That's another flavor of this Scrum call. So here's the right way to do it. Is we want to start a user story and focus on that user story. Do the analysis, coding, and testing. Get that user story done as quickly as possible. Then move on to the next user story. Do the analysis, coding, and testing. Put it to bed. Then move on to the next one. And that's another discipline that's really, really hard for teams. Is we're so ingrained in this, we gotta do the full analysis of everything. And then here's what makes it worse, is after they do the analysis, they figure out there's a lot we don't know. We can't start coding, because now we've uncovered all kinds of unknowns. The things that we didn't know, now we know that we don't know. And so we can't code it. So how do you solve for that?
More analysis.
What's that? More analysis, yeah. Which will only lead you to discover things that you didn't know.
So I would say on your proper sprint, put the T before the C. Or actually put it before the E. You want to test first. That's it, TDD. Or behavioral driven development. Because that's where you programmatically put your requirements into code. And you just write the code and solve that test.
I think maybe that T kind of refers to QA.
Isn't your QA?
The test coding could be in the coding section, you're suggesting?
You could almost make it like, just, those are activities that happen with different frequency, but it doesn't have to happen in that order. And is it, because that also implies like there's no analysis at the end of the sprint. Well, there's analysis throughout, right, with just different degrees of frequency, so,
Yeah.
sort of. maybe.
So one of the things here is that another big failure pattern in Agile is product owner, product manager, they'll come with a user story that says, okay, I want to be able to integrate with all of our data that we have, all of our customer data. I want it integrated with our Salesforce.com. Go ahead and do it for the next one.
That's like a release.
Okay. So what do we do with that, right? So a lot of organizations that what they've done is say, hey, just put that in our backlog, and then we'll start a sprint, and then we'll see how much progress we make. At least we'll get it started. Problem is that, and product managers seem to love that because it reduces their workload.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you mean I don't have to write a spec? I can just make an edict, and the engineers will then figure out what they need to do and then do it? That's like going to a builder and say, hey, build me a house. And I'll come and take a look at it, see if I like it. If I don't like it, I'll tell you where I don't like it, then you'll break it down and build me another one. You can try that. I don't think you're gonna get anybody to work with you on that kind of a basis, but it happens in software, and people think that's Agile development. I'll just tell you what to build. You build it, and I'll guide you.
It's prototype.
Yeah, it's not even prototyping. It's insanity, right? You have to give some measure. There's got to be. So developers talk about this definition of done. How do we define done? Well, there's also got to be a definition of ready. When can a product manager, product owner, say that this user story is ready to be worked on? And so there's actually, just like there's a definition of done, there's a definition of ready, sort of a template that looks something like this. Just bring it up. see if this would make your life easier. So, the business value has to be clearly articulated. Details are sufficiently understood by the development team so that it can complete the user story. Dependencies are identified. No external dependencies would block the completion of the user story. Team is staffed appropriately to complete the user story. The user story is estimated and small enough to comfortably fit into a sprint. And a PSI if it's a feature at the release planning. If we're looking at a feature, it would have to fit comfortably within a PSI. The acceptance criteria is clear and testable. Performance criteria are defined and testable. Scrum team understands how to demonstrate the user story at the sprint review. So this is what you give your product manager or your product owner and say, okay, when the user story meets these criteria, we're ready to now work on it. Otherwise, it's not ready. It stays in the backlog. We can talk about it, but we're not going to commit to it. That would eliminate a lot of the failure patterns that exist today in Agile teams. Because a lot of times teams take on user stories, they're not even quite sure what it is or how to demo it or how to, they spend 3 or 4 days just talking about it. Well, that's half your time box is shot. So this also puts the burden on the product owner to say, okay, I'm gonna work with the team to figure out what this is, but I've got to actually drive it to get to that state where the teams can actually, we call it, we want to make it actionable. So user stories, you can start it out with one sentence. You can start out and say, hey, I want to integrate with Salesforce.com. That's a good start. But in order to make it actionable, you've got to get, okay, so which part of your app do you want to integrate with which part of Salesforce.com? It's not a one-to-one mapping. So how do we want to deal with certain conditions? How do we, that all needs to be articulated. And the other concept is one of having a conversation. So one of the thought leaders in Agile, his name is Ron Jeffries, came up with this concept of the 3 C's, which is you start out with a user story, but then the idea is to have a conversation. And this is what I was saying earlier, a lot of development teams, they're so used to that monologue. They expect the product owner to be omniscient and tell you exactly how to integrate our app with Salesforce.com. The reality is, they have a need, they don't quite know how to get there. You need to have this conversation. So they might start out with, okay, so let's talk about how do we integrate with Salesforce.com? Well, okay, so which modules? So the developer might ask, well, which modules do you want to integrate with? How do we handle these failure conditions? And the product owner may go away and say, okay, I'm going to go do some research. I'm going to talk to some of our clients. I'm going to talk to accounting. I'm going to talk to legal and figure that out. But they need a lot of input from development so they can do their job. And so that's why this conversation is critical. Without that, it becomes kind of a monologue, and it actually becomes really hard to be agile if you can't have good conversations with the business. And then finally, we have the confirmation. This is where all the details go. And the template for that is verify that. So this is where all the details of the user story can go. So if you've integrated with Salesforce.com, okay, now verify that when I go to this module of Salesforce.com, the total amount is now reflecting the same amount as it is in our estimation app. So you can have a whole list of details that verify that this user story is in fact completed. So the product owner role actually becomes critical in this, because if they don't describe things well enough and thorough enough, you can't get that level of agility. So in Scaled Agile Framework, the product owner role is a full-time role. You can't be a product owner in development.
Are they different from product manager?
Yes. So that's another thing is a product owner is a much more strategic role, I mean, a much more tactical role. So if you think about the Salesforce.com example, the product manager might say, hey, we need to integrate with this module of Salesforce.com. That's it. Product owner that lives on the team, they'll have to figure out a lot of the details and the mapping and dealing with the error conditions and dealing with the situations where we're trying to put in a square peg in a round hole, all those details. And so that's a full-time role. Scrum Master, the recommendation is that Scrum Master is a part-time role. Because a Scrum Master is making sure that the team is facilitated and has what they need, but that's not a full-time role. So a lot of times what's recommended is to have a Scrum Master that's has a project management background, be the Scrum Master of 2 teams. So then it becomes a full-time role. Product owner may be able to do 2 teams also, but usually it's, depending on the level of complexity, ends up being just enough for 1 team. Because remember, they also have to be thinking ahead of, okay, so here are all the things that are in our backlog that still need to be worked out. Because if we want to get to that definition of ready, you can see that's a lot of work. All right, how are we doing on time?
It's 10 after 9.
Okay, cool. So I'll hang out a few more minutes. If you guys want to come up and chat, be happy to do that. If you want me to come and talk to your company, or if you're having certain issues, feel free to email me, and we'll see what we can do.
Thank you very much, and it's another exciting session. And Armand didn't mention about the slides, so I'll get them up on our website along with the videos, hopefully within the next week or so. If we're efficient at it, yes.
Put it in a sprint.
Thank you.
Yeah, split it up. It's a lot of work.
Yeah, my product backlog. You haven't seen it. Okay, there's still some leftover pieces.